Hi there guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I am going to be sharing with you how I set up my quilts, which I'm going to be quilting today using my home domestic machine. And on this table, as you can see, I have this layout in my sewing room. I have a table here and it actually folds off. So I can show you here. So it folds off here, and I'm going to show you how I set this up so that I can be quilting it with minimal kind of pushing and pulling, so that you get the best out of your domestic machine. So this is about 70-inch by 60-inch quilt. I'll put the size of the quilt right here. It's a together quilt. I'll put a link to the pattern as well. So I am going to be quilting this free motion quilting using my home domestic machine. So a lot of the people who just started quilting will ask whether we can actually quilt large quilts using your sewing machine. It's definitely possible, but it takes a lot of effort. So you do have to put that in mind. It is not that easy, but it gets easier with a lot of practice. So I have a lot of practice because all of my quilts I quilted myself, and I do have a lot of things that I've learned over the time, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. So the first thing I would do before I start quilting is actually to do a practice piece. Now I know a design that I want to do with this because it's a heart quilt. I actually want to do a loop with a heart just to get it matched. And that's how I usually choose my pattern. It's basically something that is coordinating with the pattern itself, with the quilt pattern itself, or coordinating with the fabric selection in there. So I have made a small practice sandwich, one with a solid, and usually it's a color of a dark color because I'm using light thread, and then on the back is a printed fabric. So the reason I do this is that because this is a practice piece, I am just going to play around with it. I'm going to do the pattern that I want and trying to get the motion installed in my brain. Although I do have a lot of practice, it's been a while since I've been free motion quilting in between piecing quilts, so it does do a lot when you actually start practicing first. It just sort of like reminded you what are the patterns and how we are supposed to do the motion. Now on the back is actually a printed fabric. Now the reason is that this side won't show up, the quilting won't show up as much. So on this side you can actually use it for purses. So if you want to do a purse using this, you can actually just add zipper and it'll become a purse, and the quilting wouldn't show up as much. And this is why I like using this kind of practice piece, because I won't be wasting it. So let's get started, and I'll show you the pattern that I'm going to try and do it, and then I'll show you how I set up my quilts in a while. As you can see here, I'm setting up my machine for free motion quilting. So I have my free motion quilting foot on, so that's the first thing you want to do. I'm using the hopping foot. So this is the common foot that you can actually get for most of the domestic machine. I'll put a link to a generic one below. So mine has this kind of a clear plastic. There's also a metal one. So depending on what you are comfortable with, you can select this one so that you can see your design as you quilt it, or you can use the metal one as well because it has a large kind of like center as well. So I'm using a Janome Horizon. It does have a larger throat because I've upgraded it. After doing a lot of quilting, I know that I wanted a larger throat quilt machine, which is something that I think one of the best investment that I've made, because it's so much easier when you have a larger throat machine. However, I have quilted a few quilts with a smaller standard domestic machine, and it is harder and it takes longer time, but it's definitely possible as well. The other option is actually to use this hovering. So this is probably not for all machine, but I have a high shank, which means that the position of the screws is quite high as compared to the domestic machine. And I have this option to use this hovering one. It does not hop as you go, so it basically just hovers. So sometimes some people don't like the hopping motion because it disturbs the the view of what you're quilting. So this one is also an option. This one is what we call open toe. You can see it does not close a loop, so you have an open toe. This one I like to use for custom quilting. So for this, because I'm just doing an all over quilting, I am going to use the hopping foot. So once I've got the foot down, I want to lower the feed dog. So the feed dog is this sharp kind of like zigzag thing on your machine. And for a lot of the machine, you can actually lower it down. So my machine have a lowering on the other side. So I'm just turning that on the other side of the machine. Our foot is actually going below the plate itself. So it's not going to raise up and you're not going to feel that zigzag thing on top. So this will make your movement a little bit smoother. So the point of this feed dog is to feed your fabric if you're sewing it straight. But then if you're free motion quilting, you want to be free so that it actually falls below the plate. Now if you don't have that, what you can do is tape it carefully around it so that it does not disturb your quilting. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to put in on the Supreme slider on top. So this is a Teflon sheet. It has a very smooth surface and it reduces the friction between your quilt and also the machine. So I'm going to put this on. Okay, mine has a lot of holes because I accidentally poked them a lot of time, but it's still very useful. I'm going to put a link to this as well. Mine has a lot of hole. I think I'm about to replace it, but this is the honest truth. So this thing has a sticky side on the other side, and if it's not anymore, it's not sticky anymore, you need to kind of wash it so that you can get sticky again. So that's what happened. If you don't get it sticky, then it starts to move, and that's when you start making holes like this. So now I am ready to get started. So I'm starting with my practice piece. So idea is I can start doodling first before I quilt. So if you've never done the motion before, it's best to kind of like doodle it with a pen and paper, and then you can start transferring the motion with the quilting itself. So before you move on to this, I like to kind of recommend that you would do it with pens and paper first. So I'm going to do that first. So usually I like to practice whenever I'm not at the machine. So usually this is in meetings or when I'm talking to the phone. This is a great time for you to kind of practice all different motions or the free motion quilting. The idea is that you want to get a continuous line of a design, and sometimes the movement or the motions of this design really needs quite a practice so that you can get smoother as you go on the machine. So I am going to go ahead and practice doodling first. And if you don't know where to start, I do have a quilting workbook that is included in the Free Motion Quilting Bootcamp. You can actually follow along, trace along some of the designs in here, and just to get started. There's also a start, and then you have to kind of fill it in with the motion that you want to try. So there's a lot of different patterns here, but I'm going to show you a different one right here. So this one is a version of a loop. So I want to get that heart inside. So I'm going to start with a heart and then a circle around it, and then a heart and a circle around it. It's always good to stop, and you want to know where to stop so that your motion is kind of smooth all the way. So I know that if I stop here and start thinking where I'm going, it'll be smoother rather than non-stopping and just trying to go ahead and ahead without thinking where you're going to go. You're going to be bound to make mistakes. So I stop right here just to think where I'm going. I may want to kind of fill it in a bit here, so now I'm moving in. Stop right here. And the same thing goes when you're actually quilting on the real quilt. So you can stop there and start thinking where you're going to fill it in. So if you follow the free motion quilting bootcamp, I actually teach you how to kind of go in quarters of your quilt. So starting from the center, you want to finish the first quarter first before going on to the other side. So you want to try and be able to fill in this diagonally all the way to the end. However, if you aren't able to do that, what you can do is actually go to the edge and restart from the center again. Because when you start from the center, so let's say this is the center of the quilt, you want to go ahead towards the edges so that you can ease the fabric as you go along the sandwiches. Otherwise, when you go back this way towards the center, so if you're moving this way, this is the edge of the quilt and this is the center. If you're going to move inwards towards the quilt, you're going to be bound to make puckers in your quilt, and I want to avoid that. That's the easiest thing that happens when you're quilting with a domestic machine, because you're not stretching the quilt, you're kind of pushing it through, and it's easier to get puckers on the back of the quilt, especially because you can't see it. So this is one of the idea on how to reduce that puckering, and I have done a lot of time, and I actually didn't listen to my own advice. So once I get to the here, and sometimes I want to go back here, like I go all the way here and then I go back here, and then I'll get a pucker around here. So what I try to do now is try to fill in the one that's close by in a diagonal. If you can't, then just go ahead and fill in a certain area that you can actually just ease it out towards the edges, and then restart from the center. So I'm here, I'm trying to fill this area close by. So as you can see here, if I'm going back around here, I am going inside the quilt. So rather than doing that, which I may have like puckers around here if I do that, so I would just go towards the edges. You can see as well, I try to kind of change the directions of the heart just to get it all over so that it makes a random look all around. So finish this off, I would say do at least an A4 paper to practice, and then you can move on to your sandwich. So I'll move on to my sandwich. I think I got the idea already on how I want to do this quilt. So let's get started. So I am on my quilt sandwich right here. It's a rectangle kind of quilt sandwich, but it doesn't really matter. It's not a proper quilt sandwich. The batting is actually quite small, but it's just a practice piece. So I'm going to start from this corner. I'm going to try and just fill it in all the way to the other corner. So what I do first is lower down the feet dog, lower down the foot. And then I'm holding on to this thread and I'm putting my needle down and up position again, and then it'll pick up the bobbin thread and I'll hold both of these together. And I will do a couple stitches in position just to secure that stitch, and then I'll start moving on along. I don't like that to be in the way. I just take it out. So now I can start my motion. So you can, at this stage, you can move it whatever you like. So if you feel like your motion is easier this way or easier, whatever, how you feel comfortable, you can just turn it around. So I say it's different for some people. I like to do my motion pushing as I see the motion. So that's how I'm going to do it. Again, stop. Stop. probably I want to go this way, so I'll turn my quilt around. I'm gonna fill in this way. And I want to fill in this way as well, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So I am actually passing the center here. If it was the center of the quilt, I wouldn't do this. I would just probably just move on along this way and restart this later. But this is a practice sandwich, so I'm just moving along just to get that pattern. Now, as you go along, you'll notice that sometimes you'll tend to do certain things repeatedly. Like I have this directions of the heart is probably similar. So I would stop right there and start thinking of how to change this direction, just so that you get a random kind of like spread of the hearts in different directions, unless if that's what you're aiming for. Always find the time to stop. Okay, stop and evaluate whether you have some empty spaces. Let's see over here, I do have some big spaces here, but all over probably I can have more of this big spaces, just to make sure that all over it does not show up as this is an empty space. Now, also not to be so critical about your work. This is a small piece of quilt. Of course, you're going to see like a lot of mistakes or like the thing that you don't like on this little piece of quilting. So I think I'm done with this. It is kind of a small piece, harder to actually go to the edge. If I'm working on the real quilt, I'll show you later. If I'm working on the edge, I just like to fill in some of this area. Maybe not with a heart, but with some of the random kind of squiggly lines, just to make sure that it's all filled up to the edge. Okay, let's get started with the quilt. Right, for the quilt, what I'm going to do is get all of the quilts onto my table. So the first thing I do is actually clear out the space around the sewing machine. If you have an extension table, this is the time before you put all the quilts, of course, this is the time to do it. I don't have an extension table, so I tend to actually put my quilts all above the level of my needle right here, needle plate. So you want to get your quilt up like this so that kind of like use that gravity towards the needle. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to place my, I'm going to place my quilt right here. So I've basted my quilt. So I'm going to put it in. Just make sure that this one is in the center. So I'm going to fit it in carefully and then bring it all the way to the center. And have all of my quilts on top of the table. Roughly to the center. I'm not really sure where the center is. So probably you have to see where your center is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so this is the center. Okay. The good thing about working from the center is that this is the hardest part of your quilting journey throughout quilting this big quilt, because this is when you have all the mushed together, like all the bulk of the quilt is mushed together inside the throat of the quilt, and it's like everywhere. At the edge, you will notice that you only like quilt only the area, and it's easier to move around because all of the quilt is kind of like somewhere static. So this is the most hardest place, and I always say eat the frog first. Do the hardest first, and then you'll get easier later. So you get motivated to kind of finish the quilt. So the idea of starting from the center one is actually to remove the possibility of having puckers inside your quilt, especially at the back. But it's also good to start from the center because you know that this is the hardest part that you have to go past through. So what I like to do is divide this quilt into quarter. So I'm going to tackle the first quarter, which is going to be the quarter that is close to me. So that's how I like to quilt. So basically I'm pushing it all the way, and then I finish the first quarter, and then I will move on to the other quarters. You can see a full diagram of this inside my blog post, or I'll put a link down below, or also on inside Free Motion Quilting Bootcamp. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start from the center, and I'm going to mark it so that I know I would come back to that to kind of like continually from that start. So I'm just going to mark it with my basting pin right here, and I'm going to show you how I put my quilt. So basically you don't want any quilts right here because it's dragging and it's making you hard, and it's making it harder to move the quilt. So you want to kind of like place it a bit up, and also the one here you want to be like making a hill. I would like to say it's making a hill, and just focus on a certain area inside here, make it flat on the area that you want to do. So I'll show you as we get closer, but basically this is how I set up my quilts. Any size quilt this is how I do it. So inside the throat, I'll show you in a while. Come here. Come, let's get closer. So inside the throat, I kind of just squish it along here. Not really in a particular of like a roll. I'm just squishing it right there. And as you can see here, I'm starting from the center right here. And I'm trying to keep this kind of like probably the size of my palm right here, as flat as possible. So this is the area that you're going to be focusing on quilting at a time. So once you finish this, you're moving on, and then you kind of flatten it as well in this area. So this is the only area that you have to focus. Okay, another thing that I want to share with you is that free motion quilting using a domestic machine or anything, I think, will take a toll on your body. So you do need to take a lot of breaks. So for me, what I like to do is probably a certain area and then I would stop. So normally that is about 20 to 30 minutes, and I would stop totally and I'll come back and then quilt it. So for this kind of large quilts, maybe it takes 6 to 8 sittings before I finish it off. So this is what I'm going to start now. I'm going to show you how I start this quilt, and then probably show you a snippets of the whole process before I get finished. Okay, so let's get started. So as you can see here, I'm just pulling it up so that it feels like a hill here, so it's not dragging. I would start just the same as I would start the previous one. Probably put it on here and pull it up and hold on to that. You can cut this off later. So I normally, you can bury it if you like. Sometimes I just cut it off because I tend to make a securing stitch right there so that it doesn't come off. But some people like to bury this in, so you have to put your needle in and bury it later. So I like anything fast, so I just secure it with a few stitches in the same position and then start moving. Okay, so I leave it. The first one I usually leave it because I know that I want to come back to that, so I can see it. Okay, move it along. I feel like it's a bit hard for me to kind of move it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wear my glove. So I'll put a link to this glove as well. It's just a cheap glove that you can get and it has a sticky dot on top. So this will increase the friction of your hand with the quilt. So that one you want the friction so that it does move nicely. So where am I? I am right there. So just every time you stop, you kind of have to figure out where you're going next. So I'm going to go here. Okay. If I find that my hand is a bit too far, I adjust the quilt and then get my hand closer to the needle again. Again, you can see the quilt is getting up here, so you want to flatten it again. As you can see here, I'm moving towards this side, which I try to fill in this side. So I'm going back to this side here to fill it in before it goes too far that you're going inward. So if it's not that far from your last stitches, it should be fine. So let me get you closer because you can't really see. It's white on white. That's what the point is. If it's white on white, then you, even though you make a mistake, it's fine. So let me see if I can get you closer to just see what I'm doing. Okay. So as you can see, as I'm moving along, I'm kind of like releasing some of that, pressing it flat and then releasing some of the air pockets towards the edges of the quilt. So we are, this is the center and this is the edge of the quilt right here. So you want to go ahead and do that. Keep repeating and doing that, and you should be able to avoid any puckering that way. you start feeling some friction or you feel like it's getting heavier, move your quilt so that you get more support from the other side of this. So I'm feeling it right now because my quilt is kind of like falling off the table. So I'm trying to actually just squeeze it along to the closer to the needle again. So when I'm quilting in all over quilt, I don't really look at the patterns anymore because it's just an all over quilt. And I'm usually using threads that does not show up as much. You just want to have a little bit of texture to your quilt, and I really like how fast it can covers an area rather than the custom quilting. But of course, this is personal preferences. So if you do not like your quilting to kind of like go all over your patterns, then maybe you can do custom quilting. But for me, sometimes this does not take over the pattern itself. It's just a random hearts all over. I'm using a thread that does not show up as much. It's just going to give that little bit of texture to the quilt. Okay, so as I was talking about that, I actually did a mistake. So I'm going to show you here. So what is my mistake? Okay, so you can see that I actually stop not at the right position. So I showed you just now in the doodle that every time I finish a heart, I would stop right in the center of the heart. Instead, this one, I was talking to you and I stopped there. And then when I start to continue again, you can see that kind of like jagged, weird kind of line. But that's okay. It happens. You're not going to find it once the quilt is done. So I don't really mind. I just put it aside and just continue on. This big quilt, you won't find it again, okay? So I stop in the center and then start. So stop in the center of the heart. That wouldn't show as much. So let's get this baby done and I'll show you the progress as we go along. So I have been quilting for about 10 to 15 minutes. I will show you my progress. I'm already taking a break. So you can see we started from here. And I wanted to cover this area here, and we've covered a lot of it as well within that 10 to 15 minutes. And that is how I do my large quilt, in little by little, and it will actually eventually get finished. And I think it's the mindset that having it not finished in one sitting is really important, because I don't think you can actually, push yourself to finish it unless it's a baby quilt. But even a baby quilt, I would stop a couple of times throughout the day. You can finish it in a day, but I will break it up into 30 minutes fragments of time to quilt it. Otherwise you will hurt your body and you don't want to come back to quilting it anymore. So I think that's the key to it, and I've got quite a lot. I'm pretty happy. It was getting easier because I'm getting to the edge. As you can see, that's the edge of my quilt, so that's not much more to kind of fill in. So that is how I do my large quilt. So I hope you learned a little bit of how you can actually quilt using a domestic machine. Even large quilt is possible, little by little. So I think it's the mindset, and also stop whenever you need to, because even you pushing through might not be benefit for you and it hurts your body. I know because I've done it. So I tried to actually finish a baby quilt in just one sitting. It did get finished, but my body was so aching the day after. So I do want to recommend that you kind of stop and move along, and it's just about focusing on just one little area at a time. I do love the idea of free motion quilting and all over design because it's very quick. But if you want to, once you actually master the free motion quilting, you can actually do a custom quilting as well. So for custom quilting, I also recommend starting from the center and moving towards the edges to avoid that puckering and also smoother finish in the end. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comment if you are a beginner in free motion quilting, or if you've been quilting free motion quilting for a while, and let me know your current project as well. So I'll see you in the next video. Hopefully you have a nice time quilting. I'll see you again. Don't forget to subscribe and click the like button, because that will help me get algorithm up and then share this with more people. So thank you. With that, I'll see you again next time. Bye bye. Oops, by the way, if you want to see the finish of this quilt, make sure you come along and subscribe, because I'll be sharing in one of my quilty tube in the future. So hopefully you'll get to see it finished, and I'll be sharing that on the blog as well. So come along on the blog, come along on Instagram, and subscribe to this channel. See you again. Bye bye.